Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity. Partner Paul Kelly introduces our keynote speaker.
It's with great pleasure that I present to you our keynote speaker, Chris Varney. Chris is the founder and Chief Enabling Officer of iCan Network. iCan Network is a driving of a rethink of autism so that young Australians on the spectrum think I can and not I can't. Without further ado, I welcome Chris to the stage, and if you could welcome him as well. Thank you very much.
I like my props. I was 16 and I was in Northern Africa, standing in a community centre called Shambrai. And I was surrounded by about 50 people around me, most of whom had HIV and AIDS. And we were listening to their stories, and they were stories that started off very sadly. They spoke about how receiving a diagnosis of HIV had meant that they'd lost their family, they'd lost their friends, and become a very marginalised group in this community, Shambrai. And the end of the stories was triumphant. We were watching their 5-year anniversary of having brought together this big group of people. And the stories were so rich with the inclusion that they had achieved, how these people had their lives back, how no matter what health challenges they were facing, they now had this beautiful social connection that they were experiencing. And in the midst of this, hearing this as a 16-year-old, you were just in awe. When sometimes you meet someone with a label, you go through this process of going, is there something I need to be doing? Is there some conversation I need to be having differently? And at the end of the day, you just need to be yourself. And there was this woman, Christine, who I will never forget. And Christine got up at the end, she was their leader, and she'd had HIV for 15 years. And she'd actually been elected the local mayor in this community. And she said some words that really have always stuck with me. And she just looked at this community that she was working with and she said, "Your freedom has been my purpose. I've kept my head in the clouds, but I've kept my feet on the ground." And with that, she turned to us youth ambassadors. We're all pretty young from World Vision. And she handed us all this broom. And it was the ultimate sign of belonging in this community. And she said, "Look, I give you this broom because no one is above each other here. And we have big vision, but we all do the real work." And it was a very humbling moment as a 16-year-old with a supposed special title of youth ambassador, sitting here watching a woman that had her own challenges but had really dedicated every single day she had to this community who had actually used their challenges and their diagnosis to build this incredible culture. The group had gone from the margins of the community to the centre of the community. People who had other challenges, other labels like disabilities, were now part of it, and the community had actually been redefined around it. And I share that story today because I think a conference like this, where we have lots of conversations, whether it might be about board relationships, whether it might be about mergers, for me, the common thread between us is that sense of purpose. The great opportunity of being part of a not-for-profit is that hopefully there's a social purpose that you're working towards. And when I think of that concept of purpose, I always think of Christine because she was so driven by purpose. And so I wanted to share it today because purpose can be the make or break in a team. It can be, what can unite a board or management team. It can also be the difference between your work engagement and your burnout. And I thought I might share it today and offer you some of the journey I've had to develop my sense of purpose. So I'm going to talk with you about how purpose needs to come from some sense of struggle, how purpose needs to be relevant, how in developing your purpose, whether personally or professionally, you need to embrace some learnings, and we'll talk about that later. How your purpose must be real and must be something that you can share with others. And so to start off, my purpose, and I'm going to take you through how I got here, is really about bringing out the awe in autism. And I think purpose for all of us needs to start from a very emotional place. It needs to come from a place of struggle or love. And so I thought I'd share with you what I was like as a young kid, blessed to be on the spectrum. Sometimes my family would simply look at me as, all right, this kid's from just a bit of a different planet. I was living in outer eastern Melbourne, at a place 15 James Road in Ferntree Gully. My brother and sister certainly lived there, but I certainly echoed from somewhere else when you look at this picture. My mum likes to say that men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and autistic people are just from Pluto. And I look at this photo, and my brother on the left, Stephen, who's just your total boy's boy, he's now in the fire brigade. That's what he wanted to do at 5 years of age, and he went through about 12 different pairs of shoes a year because he was obsessed with footy and cricket and lived on the oval. My sister Marion in the middle had a friggin' new hairstyle every single day, and she was definitely from Venus. And then there was me. And we never had to worry about whether I needed any instructing about getting ready because I had my routine. I had my socks pulled up, my shirt tucked in, my top button done up. I've come a long way from 9 years of age. And then that incredible comb over without one hair out of place. That wasn't even gel. I had this sensory thing with gel, so that was just water that would stay like that throughout the day. And I look at that picture and I just think, I was just ahead of my time. We talk a lot about hipsters today, and I really was trying to set the trend back then. But for me, when I'm in about grade 3 here, it's my sister's first day of school, and up until this point, I had actually been a pretty rejected kid. My family were part of their own big network, but had found when I came along and I really demanded a different form of parenting. My parents had had to think very differently about where they took me, what outings I went on. And quite quickly, my parents were getting uninvited from children's play dates because I had certain things that I needed at a social outing to make me feel comfortable. I had my strengths, obsessions and anxieties, and my patterns and routines, and sometimes it was very hard to work out what the trigger was of my anxiety. And for a lot of the time when I was a kid, I had a real challenge sharing with you what was wrong. But you could tell something was wrong because I had this quiet, anxious look about me. And so in my kindergarten and early primary school years, this network, my siblings and my parents, had been my whole world. And they were kind of my tribe. And even though they were younger, Stephen and Marion, my brother and sister, were definitely my protectors in the schoolyard because I would walk around and sometimes get a bit eaten alive because I wouldn't pick up things the same way as other kids. Sometimes they said funny things. I would love to come across as an adult, even though I was an 8-year-old. And so being 9 going on 90 in this picture, I was lucky to have my quirks really embraced by my family. But I also had the benefit of some other influences who provided that significant other in my life. Because all our literature says on young people that in our primary school years, our families, so in the middle, our families are our whole network. They're who informs our decisions. When we're transitioning to high school, we start to listen to others, and our peers start to take the place of our parents and our families in helping us develop our sense of self. And I was really lucky with the people that got behind me from the age of about 10 to 14 because they were this incredibly positive voice. I wanted to share them because they really are, when I think of my journey to develop my sense of purpose and my organisation's purpose, they're an important rock in that journey. My grandfather on the left, his name was Bob, and he had 21 grandkids, and it's safe to say that I was definitely the most demanding of the 21. And the wonderful thing about him was he was a very physically disabled man. The whole left side of his body didn't work. He couldn't walk, he couldn't talk properly. And he just knew that I was a kid that needed some extra reinforcement, some extra reminders of what made me great. And he was very good at always saying, look, Chris, you're just my best pal. And my first steps of becoming an independent person were really helping him out because when I was in upper primary school, I had about 3 friends in the world, and Bob was one of them. I would kind of do laps around my primary school yard because I found recess and lunch just pretty terrifying. And he was a guy that worked out that I needed a little bit of positivity, a little bit of encouragement, and he was a very motivating force in my life. Because he had such huge challenges himself, he would often his voice would get in my head. And whenever I was coming up against a challenge of my own, however simple or complex it might have been, it was always the terror of disappointing him that pushed me forward and said, I can in my head. And I can, as a message, really came from him because he showed me, even though nothing was really working for him physically, he had this strength of mind, this positivity and sense of humour. And for me, I always remember that. And if you've got those 3 things, no matter what life throws at you, you're well set. Now, I had a teacher, Christine Horvath, another Christine, in the top right there. And she was someone who was very good at developing networks for every kid and teenager around her. Now, she met me when I was 12. And my parents have been terrified about which high school to send me to. I've never seen my mum that anxious about a decision because the wheels had fallen off in upper primary school and it was time to try and look for a change. And this woman grabbed my mum's hand and said, look, I will make school a home away from home for Chris. And she was so dedicated that she actually called me on my enrolment day at this school. And I was not someone that really liked phone calls. But she called me and said, look, I'm here, you can always come and chat to me if you need. And she was just someone that made sure that every single person around her had an activity, had a job, and had something that made them feel important. And I always remember her example because she was someone that just joined you up. No one was on the margins when you were working with her. And I want you to just kind of remember these 2 people, Bob and Christine, because they'll be important later in the story. But to kind of share with you, I guess, what I was like, this is a bit of a cartoon of my brother and I. My brother read Aladdin, and I would read encyclopedias. What was important to me was not what was in your footy record, given we're here at the MCG. What was important to me was understanding the different royal families of Europe, from Scotland, France, England, and Spain. And I wanted to understand this across 4 different centuries, because when I met this bloke, Henry VIII, in a documentary I watched at grade 3, I was like, this is fascinating. I need to understand and pick up, what English history has been about. And there was this hilarious moment when I was in primary school. This can just demonstrate sometimes how us on the spectrum can be a bit out of sync with things. When my teacher, Miss Thermopoulos, set an assignment, and I thought, look, this is my moment. I'd kind of trailed off, didn't really pay attention to the instructions. And I went home and I put together, regurgitated my book here into the different royal families of Europe on a big yellow piece of cardboard. And it was incredible. It marched the English royal family from Henry VII in the late 1400s right down to Elizabeth II, and I was very proud of it. And I marched up to Miss T the next day, and she just looked at this incredible, intricate grey lead going all through this yellow cardboard. And she looked at it and she said, oh, Chris, sweetheart, our assignment is on winter. Would you mind just keeping it to clouds and rain? Maybe some polystyrene and some fluff here and there. That's all you need to do, love. And so there would be these wonderful moments where I would go about and put this detail and focus and memory, which are the great strengths of anyone on the spectrum. But sometimes when the rest of the world doesn't know how to work with us or doesn't necessarily understand our different structures, these things can be a source of doubt or negativity in ourselves. And so that network around me were very important. They were very relevant in my life because they did kind of keep me on track whenever I was falling into this negative self-doubt. And whilst our purpose must come from an emotional place, mine comes from my own family and friendship network, it must also be relevant. And some years ago, I was very lucky to be Australian Youth Representative to the UN, which again sounds like a really fancy title. And in that role, I was going around Australia trying to represent this big cohort of young Australians. And I interpreted that role as really trying to give a voice to people who were on the margins. And so that took me into juvenile detention centres where I was meeting a lot of, unfortunately, Aboriginal young people, because we have a shocking overrepresentation of Aboriginal young people in juvenile detention centres. To give you one statistic, it's as high as 70% of young residents in WA are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And it's very well documented that that's because of over-policing and targeting. And so that's how I kind of expressed the role. And I was lucky to have some wonderful Aboriginal young people who started a book of letters to Kevin Rudd, who was then Prime Minister. This is back in 2009. And this book grew to about 800 letters in size, and we gave it to Kevin Rudd, and it was a very significant moment. But the thing that kept coming up through that role was the stories I was hearing of kids and young people on the spectrum. See, the thing that's probably important to share with you in my story was that I was only told I was on the spectrum at 14. I was a bit of a dramatic unit, and so I think my family worked out, we reckon he'll opt out of things if he knows a bit earlier. I've certainly met other kids who can hear the diagnosis early and take it in their stride, and it's just about when you've got the maturity to handle it. But I think you can tell from me, I loved my melodrama, and so any excuse not to do things, I probably would have taken it. But here I was in my young 20s, with no one knowing I was on the spectrum, in this youth rep role where I kept hearing teachers talk about, I don't have time to support these kids, or it's too hard and I've got the rest of the class to manage. Or I would meet incredible teachers who were hoping that their colleagues would understand. I was meeting young people on the spectrum who weren't really writing me letters because they felt uncomfortable doing that, or they were so not used to anyone asking for their voice or opinion on anything. And I'll never forget one girl who just said, well, I guess this means I just can't do things having Asperger's. And it was this moment, I was in Darwin, Northern Territory, and I was only 22, and I just felt, it was this earth-shattering, right, I've had this incredible upbringing where great networks around me have worked me into my community. They've made sure I wasn't on the margins. And here in this role, I was meeting people, my peers on the spectrum, who had had such a vitally different experience. And to really bring that home, if we look at some of our data from ABS in 2014, this might be some news for you. 58% of Australians with autism are unemployed, which is such a senseless waste of their strengths and their individual talents. Now, why is that happening? I would argue a contributing factor to that is the fact that only 19% of young Australians on the spectrum are gaining a post-school qualification, which is incredibly small. Now, why is that happening? Well, again, I think a contributing factor for that would be the fact that 86% of kids on the spectrum are reporting social, emotional, and learning difficulties in our schools. And when I looked into this, I was so determined. Like, when I'd heard this kept meeting people saying, I haven't had the networks you've had, this has been a really hard ride. I was like, right. And I developed a bit of an obsession, as I do, and was exposed to about 100 schools where this was just the consistent story. And so I had a look at the path I was on. I was kind of struggling through the latter part of a law degree, thinking I'll do corporate law, or, the pathways seemed pretty set. And here was this issue, my very upbringing, and such a different expression of it on show. And I guess sometimes you have to listen for your purpose, because it won't always be clear for you. Sometimes the world, the universe, will show it to you in a really clear way. And this is what kept happening. And I guess it reminded me of what I had seen in that community in Chambrai, where a group of people that had received a diagnosis had actually used their very vulnerability to build a community of great strength. And, my motivation for passing trust law, which was an epic struggle for me, worked out that I had to turn my law notes into Harry Potter characters and spells to try and finally pass the damn thing. But my motivation was to try and think about, well, what could we do for young people on the spectrum? Wouldn't it be great if we could really challenge the grain? And that's what not-for-profits are fundamentally here to do. We're not government. We're here to challenge the grain, to work around the margins and push society forward. And so I looked at these things like limits and deficits and liability, all the words that I saw in the literature around autism, and thought, well, let's mix this up. Let's try and actually create a network of people who think about this differently, who envision a world where autism isn't something to hide, isn't something to be ashamed of, but actually a world that benefits from embracing autism. And this is the journey that my wonderful team, and many of them are here today, Rake and Andre, who work for Collins, Nora, William, Paul, and Chloe all join me. And our work is about working with kids, young people, and young professionals on the spectrum, and helping them develop channels in their life, many of which are about giving back to others on the spectrum. And our purpose is quite simple. Our purpose is to prove what people with autism can do. Because when I was sharing this idea of creating a network, and I'd done things. I had results behind my name. In the youth rep role, I'd shut down a juvenile detention centre. I'd achieved the first universal resolution on children's rights at the UN General Assembly, working with many other governments. And so I was like, right, I'm going to build this big network. I'm going to get a lot of support. And this thing happened when I was sharing the idea, where I had a lot of people who I thought would be on board shared with me deep cynicism about the idea. And this is where you need to be brave when you have stumbled across your purpose and you're facing that initial rejection that people will give a new idea. I had people say to me, oh, there's no way that people with autism can work in groups. They can't have corporate duties. How could you put them on a board? They're not going to be able to have the organisational capacity to build their own organisation. And so I was, again, in this moment where an idea felt very rejected by even some autism organisations who said, look, you just can't pull this off. And so I guess sometimes in moments when we are rejected or when people doubt you, I find that defiance is a very empowering thing and a great sense of purpose. And I think that really pushed me forward to develop a bit of an idea about how we could try and pull this off. And so this is beginning of 2014. We went about creating a young adults community of young adults on the spectrum to try and mentor teenagers and kids on the spectrum. And this is the idea that people like, there isn't evidence behind this. How would you be able to do this? And I guess there was an echoing disquiet in me and a real memory of the wonderful things that had happened to me that really pushed me forward. And fundamentally, your purpose must be real. It must be something that you're going to believe every single day. Because I knew a lot that this could work. My teacher, Mrs. Horvath, who I mentioned at the beginning, was just someone, when she had met me, she was someone that wanted to join me up with things around me. Because I was a kid that loved spelling. I could write anything, but you could never get me to stop writing. And I had real trouble working at lunchtime in my high school, and so I would kind of live at her office. And there was this one day where she just said to me, "I'm sick of you telling me all your stories in my office. Why don't we try and get you on a stage, Chris?" And unfortunately, after that, I found myself giving the Year 7 public speaking competition. I think she'd really rigged it and just plonked me there. And I was a bit of a melodramatic, depressive one, and thought, well, I'll just talk about, the meaning of life. Can't believe I tried to take that on at 13. And my mum said, "Why don't you talk about your quirky little brother?" Which I think is so ironic because his quirks are nothing compared to mine. And so through Mrs. Horvath's work, I actually won this competition, and she created a positive whisper behind my name. And really, that just kept going. She kept networking me. When I managed to get that youth ambassador role for World Vision, I think she and I knew that it was the ultimate coup, that the kid that had been, kind of on the outer had been chosen by quite a mainstream organisation. And I'll never forget, she was someone that she had bone cancer. She had had one leg amputated, and she'd really struggled to live just before I met her. And when she heard I got the youth rep role, she grabbed me outside the library and she said, "Look, Chris, I think I was meant to live so that I could meet you." And it was I've always remembered those words, and all of us have had very powerful things said to us at one form or another. And incredibly generous things to be said to me, and I always thought, well, you have to earn a statement like that. And in times when you are being rejected or where your new idea isn't getting reception, it's really important to remember the people that give you that purpose. And so when the world was saying, "This won't work," I really kept that voice of Mrs. Horvath in mind. But when you're doing this, you also need to be prepared to embrace your learnings. So when you fail and learn. And when I was getting this startup off the ground, and this was in 2014, I was also in a senior management role running the 40-Hour Famine, which is a $5 million fundraiser. And I found myself in a role where I was getting there at 6 a.m. and finishing at 6 p.m, trying to run this campaign with a big group of staff. And I was getting home and trying to achieve this organisation as a startup where young people on the spectrum would go from mentee to junior mentor, and that kept me from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. in the morning. And it was an extraordinary existence where I was run off my feet, but very energised and I guess overwhelmed by the challenges ahead of me. But I found myself at the end of this World Vision role where the organisation I loved, because they had done a lot for me, were fundamentally telling me, "This isn't working. The campaign's flopping here. You're not working well. The team who are all on board with you aren't following you. You've clearly, how are we going to make sense and achieve some balance in your life?" And it was really the first time in my, young career that I was really seeing such a failure at work. And sometimes we don't talk enough about our failures, because I guess it was a moment in time that stuck out for me where I was like, right, this isn't working. I need to make a change. Again, the universe is trying to pull me in a direction, and I'm not quite following it yet. And so I took on the feedback from the team and thought, I need to take a big, brave risk here and take the plunge into this startup I can full time. And so that's what I did, and took on board the feedback and implemented it in my style after that. But it's all well and good to have a vision and to take risks like this, but your purpose must also be real. It's got to be something that you can eat. And when we were writing our business plan, we thought, well, if we're actually going to be Australia's first business founded by people on the spectrum, we're going to have to mean what we say. We're going to have to bring this down to some numbers. And so we're proud to share that a minimum of 50% of our board, management and team must be on the spectrum. Makes life never dull. We have an incredibly quirky group. Our our equivalent of a chief operating officer, if you like, is trying to cure yellow fever in his PhD. He's actually quite a brain, won the top prize at Monash. You're joined by another bloke here who I went to primary school with, Will Rosewarne, who's quite a legal gun and an incredible governance hack. And he managed to get us DGR status in about 4 hours in his application. So Mr. 4 hours is available to you at lunchtime today, but he's ours. Don't try and take him too quickly. But these things, this is what you can eat. And I think when I think back to that woman, Christine, who said you can have your head in the clouds, but you must have your feet in the sand, and no one is above each other here. That is really what that goal helps us achieve. And so it has been this journey growing a program, because fundamentally it's a mentoring program offered in primary schools, secondary schools and universities that's trying to develop the self-acceptance and social connection of kids and young people on the spectrum. And so the team have developed this, and we were in 7 schools last year, and to give you a sense of the public need we're experiencing, we've grown from 7 to 20 programs between September and March. It's been threefold growth, if you like, just huge experience. But to give you a sense of what our program does, I thought I'd share with you, this is the team we work with, but this is our video of our schools program. One of the programs that we're really passionate about is ICANN Schools. And the idea behind an ICANN school is a school that embraces the autism spectrum for everyone's benefit.
I'm Christian. I've been on the mentoring program for 1.5 years, and I basically lead the sessions, come up with the activities for each week, come up with the games.
What activities do you do with the students in the program?
In school, I just help facilitate and encourage the participation of the kids to actually get involved and to give their opinion and to feel like they belong. And then on the camps, I am the wake-up person. I am the get-up and go. I'm the energizer.
Various activities. We play games to build rapport within the group. We do role plays. The students have an opportunity to present their ICANN talks and to do some small group activities too.
What has this program meant to you?
I see it as a program that allows, me to just be myself in an environment that's safe.
It's been very more about advancing my social skills and it really helps me to express how I feel to people easier.
I've found a lot of friends through it, people that get what it's like to have autism, like myself.
We start off the session with some warm-up games, and so the children have been able to introduce games that they want to play, as well as games that Chris and Christian have introduced. And then they have their sharing session. So every week 2 children are selected to share their interest. And that's been really amazing, because kids who previously have never had the confidence to get up to share were in fact the first kids to offer, and that was amazing. And they were able to celebrate their interest, and being in a small group, the focus was on them and they weren't nervous. And it was just, it's been amazing seeing them have the confidence to share their interests with other people.
The changes that I've seen, yes. So definitely, like one of the shyest girls. I remember when we were doing this debate activity, so it was like, go to this side of the room if you think that chocolates are better than chips, and go to the other side of the room if you think that chips are better than chocolate. She was pretty much the only one who went to the right side. All the other students went to the left side. It's pretty scary to argue a position all by yourself, but she was on fire. She really she really owned it and was able to report and everything, and spoke very confidently and came up with really good ideas.
What impact have you observed on the students from the ICANN sessions?
They're a lot more willing to talk about challenges or benefits of having autism.
What happens in these mentoring sessions? To me, these sessions are more like a confidence boost to me.
It's just important that students on the spectrum have a space in their schooling to share their interests and for those interests to be celebrated and brought out.
Look, we have a lot of fun. The imagination clubs, which are our primary school program, have been actually an amazing experience in how you can flip a conversation like special needs, because we don't talk words like autism, dyslexia, or dyspraxia, or mention any form of different learning structures. We just talk imagination. And so the kids have this status. I have a big imagination. I'm in the club. And it's actually having this wonderful problem at the moment where one of our principals is getting calls from the mainstream parents who are saying, can my kid join the club? And the principal's like, well, no, the ticket in is a diagnosis. You know, where are they on the spectrum, do you think? So that's just been wonderful to see. But I think probably when I had that failure in that World Vision gig, what really stuck out to me was the need to share your purpose with others and the need to be able to work with others and in teams to make great change. And I think a powerful reflection that we can have in our ICANN network is that it's actually been our culture that has been the strategy. I'd previously been in a role in a different organisation where I'd written the strategy and then we'd worked on the culture. And one of the interesting experiences I think we've had in ICANN is that the culture has come first, and that's really determined what the strategy has been. And so that's been really interesting. But I think your purpose must also keep calling you to be curious, and certainly ours does, in proving what people with autism can do. We're at the moment looking at how our program can reach young people with greater support requirements who aren't the very high-functioning Asperger's that I am. I live with this young man, Tim, who is non-verbal and he's a poet, writes phenomenal poetry. I'm sick of him writing it for me. I've got one whole wall. I'm reliving that Mrs. Horvath, Chris Varney situation. We've got to create platforms for him to get it out there. And we're also getting out there trying to break up the mould of what autism is and really help people embrace the great strengths of this. And to give you an example, one story that I think really brings home this whole message, I want to talk with you about a boy I know named Luke, who was on one of our camps last year. And he was a 14-year-old. His mum was registering him. She came up to the rego desk and she just had tears streaming down her face and said, "My son is screaming at me. He doesn't want to be here. He says that I'm the worst mum in the world." And we struggled for about a night and a day to get this kid engaged. And we put him on the rock climbing. He didn't really like that. And then he came down and I said, "Look, Luke, we run this with this Dress to Obsess night at our camps where everyone dresses up in their favourite obsession. So you see people who've created their own languages, their own video games. It's extraordinary when it's on show. I'm always a different Star Wars character because what J.J. Abrams has done for me in bringing Star Wars back is just very life-giving, to be frank. It's a massive obsession. Yoda really got me through corporate law. But Luke said to me, "I'm coming as a bookie to this Dress to Obsess party." And I was like, "You're coming as a bookie? Right. What, can you name different Melbourne Cup winners, can you?" And he said, "No, I'm into horse racing in Japan and the UK." I was like, "Japan and the UK?" He's like, "Oh, I do a bit online." Turns out he's earning some money to write for a blog called Sport is Made for Betting. He drives around regional Victoria over a weekend commentating on horse racing because he can remember the stats of the jockeys, the trainers, the owners, the horses. Think about it, horse racing is full of stats. And so he's got, this incredible life, but finds it absolutely nerve-wracking to be in a big group of people talking. Like, he will immediately have his face down at the floor. And we worked out all these things. And so that night, around this circle where everyone's introducing their obsessions, we had written down a bit of an interview on him. And when it came to his point in the circle, and after all the Doctor Who's had said, this is which Doctor I am, it got to Luke, who was in this bookie outfit, and he was just, chin down at the floor. And we read out what he was doing and everything that he was achieving and what his strengths were. And there was this thunderous round of applause. And you really did watch this kid move his chin up and face a room, really embracing himself for the first time. He had this wonderful freedom of self-belief. And, it really reminded me at that moment when I was 16 in that community called Chambray, watching a group of people who had been so marginalised, who had now formed such a strong sense of self. And here was this 14-year-old who, for the first time in his life, felt like he belonged. And it was just a wonderful reminder of my purpose and what keeps me going. The hilarious thing about Luke is that when you look at him online, the kid's actually got 10 million followers on Twitter. He's just smashing it. I called him up about, can you come to camp this year? But he's actually going overseas to do some international commentary. So clearly he's going to big and better places. But I really wanted to thank you for having me here today. Congratulations to Collins on a terrific conference. And I hope that if there's anything you do, think about that organisational and that personal purpose that you have. Talk with your colleagues, because it should be something that gets you straight out of bed in the morning and keeps that fire alive. So if there's anything you go and talk about today, or anything you go home and do tonight, keep thinking about what that purpose is, because mine has been a great journey figuring it out. Thank you very much.